For thousands of years, California existed unknown by the civilizations of Europe. Only native peoples lived in her valleys, swam in her ocean and rivers, and lived off her bounty. Beginning in the 1770s, however, while General Washington was leading rebels in the American Revolution, another revolution began in Alta California when Father Junipero Serra and the Spanish Franciscan monks celebrated Mass at Monterey for the first time. Prehistoric California had ended, and modern California began to work her way through Spanish, Mexican, Californio, and eventually American rule with the discovery of gold in 1848. Along the way there would be floods, fires, earthquakes, masses, and murders, all worked to shape the priests, soldiers, and natives as cultures collided. These are the stories of the California missions. Mission Santa Ines, the Mission of the Passes, was founded September 17, 1804 by Father Estefan Tapiz and is the 19th of the 21 California missions. The mission is named after St. Agnes. When she was around 13 years old, high-ranking suitors were slighted by her due to her purity and sought to persecute her for her beliefs. Her father urged her to accept her suitors' advances and deny God, but she refused. Because she slighted the powerful men who wanted her, they first tried burning her alive, but that did not work. Ultimately, she was dragged through the streets naked to a brothel and beheaded. The Mission Reservoir. Cyclone fences are probably original, but there it is. All right, here we are, Santa Ines. This is what it looked like before. Actually, this one still looks a lot like this. Quadrangle, there it is. In addition to the 1805 reservoir we just saw, Joseph Chapman, an early member of the pirate crew of Hippolyte Bouchard, who attacked the mission in San Diego and Santa Barbara, we've met him in previous videos, oversaw the construction of a fulling mill at Santa Ines for the processing of wool. Mission Santa Ines, along with Mission Santa Barbara, was one of the sites of the Chumash Revolt of 1824, when the neophytes protested their treatment by the Spanish guards. When active, this sanctuary would have only been used by the neophytes for worship. Non-Native Americans would have attended Mass in the Friars' Chapel. Today, the sanctuary contains many beautiful sacred statues. Next are 3 original bells from the mission. This is the Ave Maria Purissima 1807 bell, which was cast in Peru and originally hung in the Mission Purissima Tower. Next is the San Juan Baptista bell. It is the oldest bell and was cast in 1803. Finally is the Manuel Vargas bell, which was cast in 1817. This is a children's bell because the weight at the top is equal to the weight of the bell so that it can be easily spun by a child. And speaking of children, here you can see the imprint of a child's footprint, which was left in this adobe floor tile when it was curing about 200 years ago. Mission Santa Ines is known for the history of its music. The mission once boasted a Chumash choir and band. Ancient musical instruments on display include a violin, a violoncello, a bass viola, and a triangle. The choir sang from the loft in the church during Masses, Holy Week, and feast days. The music sheets were handwritten, sometimes on parchment, using squares for music notes. The mission boasts an extensive collection of vestments, which would have been worn by the priests during those ceremonies.
These 17th through early 19th century vestments were handmade from the cast-off dresses of the ladies of the European courts. The ladies donated their elaborate and costly silk dresses to the convents, where the nuns made the vestments worn by the priests during Mass and other religious services. Many of the early vestments come from Spain. This collection is the result of the efforts of Mamie Goulet, a young woman who came to the mission in 1904 to assist her uncle, Father Alexander Butler. Father Butler was appointed guardian of the mission in 1904 and served until his retirement in 1924. Lady Goulet devoted 20 years to the restoration of the mission. With infinite patience, she repaired the damage of the previous half-century.
Mission Santa Ines is also known for its Madonna Room.
The process of polychrome finish in Spanish wood carvings involves several stages. Generally, the faces and hands were carved in detail, with the body being a rough framework that was covered with linen.
In this room are many depictions of the Virgin Mary and also an altar.
And the detail of the figure worked into the gesso as it dried. Finally, gold or silver leaf was applied, and then the various colors were painted on.
Along with all the other missions, in 1835, Mission Santa Ines was secularized by the Mexican government. Walking past the Puerta Sancta of Santa Ines takes us out through the church graveyard. In the graveyard is another important piece of history for the state of California. In 1844, the Mexican governor of Alta California granted 34,499 acres to the College of Our Lady of Refuge of Sinners. It was the first seminary school in California. The asphalt floor left behind is all that remains of the building, which was abandoned in 1881. It had 2 stories, with the lower floor devoted to classrooms and the upper floor used for the dormitory. At one time, the adobe structure was 120 feet long and 50 feet wide.
It's the original 19th century arch.
Long before the school was built, most of the original church was destroyed in California's 1812 earthquake. It has obviously since been rebuilt, but maintaining the mission is an ongoing project at each site.
Repair work done here. Those adobe walls.
After secularization in 1833, the mission was used for many diverse activities. The mission was first rented as a residence to the Cavar-Buriz family for $500 a year. Then in 1853, Jack Powers took the grounds over to wrestle cattle. In 1900, the city of Solvang was built around the mission. Restoration of the mission began in 1904, and the mission is now one of the oldest surviving structures in California. And as always, be sure to exit through the gift shop.
Okay, go.
Fort Ross is a Russian fort that was in use from 1812 until 1841. Ross is a poetic name for Russian in the Russian language, so Russian fort. Why a video about a Russian fort in the midst of California missions? Timing and competition between the countries of Russia and Spain. The fort was founded after Mission San Juan Bautista in 1797, but before Mission San Rafael in 1817. It was also a driving force behind the founding of the last mission in Sonoma, Mission San Francisco Solano, in 1823.
All right, here we are at Fort Ross. The Russians are coming down from the north, and the Spanish are coming up from the south. And the Spanish didn't want the Russians to get any further south, and so they're putting all those missions up, and they had all the soldiers with them. Anyway, the Russians were here on the coast, hunting for fur, and maybe laying claim to California.
This building, by the way, is a windmill, very likely the first one built west of the Mississippi. The blades are no longer on it, but the model inside the museum shows what it would have looked like when it was in use, stamping bark and grinding grain into flour. Before Fort Ross was established, Russian expansion moved across Siberia and into the northern Pacific. British and American fur trade companies had also established a coastal presence in the Pacific Northwest. As they moved south, the Russians and Spanish met along the coast of Alta California. Fort Ross was established as the hub of the southernmost Russian settlements in North America in 1812, and Spain, that had already established 18 missions in California, did not want to see them move any further south. Before the Russians and the Spanish, however, the people from the top land lived in this coastal area for thousands of years. When the Russians arrived in 1812, more than 1,500 native peoples controlled a territory of at least 50 miles along the coast and 30 or more miles inland. They had complex systems of exchange with the surrounding communities with whom they traded for food, services, and other necessities. The village where Fort Ross was built was called Maitini. In 1803, the Russians first came to the Sonoma County coast on American fur trade ships. The Americans had made a deal with Alexander Baranov, a Russian trader and merchant, to hunt seals using Russian supervisors and native Alaskan hunters. In 1806, Nikolai P. Rezanov, an official of the Russian-American Company, and his translator, Georg von Langsdorff, sailed to San Francisco to explore trade with the Spanish commandant. The physician and biologist von Langsdorff was a corresponding member of the Russian Imperial Academy of Sciences, and his memoirs present a classic account of early Spanish California. His sketches of the Native Americans, their tools, and California wildlife are some of the earliest portraits of native life to have survived. These early explorers reported the sparsely populated coast back to Russia, and Russian ambassador Nikolai Rezanov recommended to Baranov that a settlement be established north of Spain's most northerly site in San Francisco. In 1812, Russians landed at Bodega Bay and named the Slavic River. We now call it the Russian River. Soon after, their leader Ivan A. Kuskov moved the group up from Bodega Bay to the inlet of the site that would become Fort Ross. He hoped the new settlement would provide food for Alaska and fur to enrich the Russian-American Company. As they had done in other new settlements, they immediately built fortifications. Just like the missions, the fort was built in the form of a quadrangle, about 300 feet square and enclosed by a redwood wall with 2 blockhouses at opposite corners.
Apparently the Russians believed in peace through strength, right? With this idea of a quadrangle that the Spanish had, the Russians had the same idea. They just used fencing here to keep people out. Probably the Spanish and the natives. There's one blockhouse. Across the way is the other.
From the fort's 2 blockhouses, any attacker could be put under a deadly barrage from Russian cannons.
It seems apparent that the Russians were very keen on keeping their fort and their interests in California.
They established themselves with such strength that the Spanish realized they had no hope of evicting them from Alta California, what they considered New Spain. The cove below is where Russian ships would have been anchored. Kayaks were dried on racks above the beach. Within the enclosure of the quadrangle was the home of the director, barracks, stores, and a chapel. Outside the fort were the company's cattle barns, housing for the Native Americans, and 2 rows of private company homes, which had their own orchards and gardens, 59 buildings in all. Colony Ross referred to the area from Point Arena to Tomales Bay, and by 1830, 3 small farming communities called ranchos near Grayton, California, Salmon Creek Valley, and on the Russian River had been established. With the help of native Californian and Aleut labor, the Russian settlers at Fort Ross became basically self-reliant. Between 1816 and 1823, they built 4 ships and also skiffs, longboats, and barges. Company employees made barrels and weapons.
Well, we reached the armory. Russian soldiers were ready.
They forged iron, cast brass, and repaired guns and other equipment. At Bodega Bay, they fired bricks, shipping 12,000 to 18,000 back to Sitka, Alaska.
Couple bedrooms.
This settlement was the center of manufacturing in California. Its products and repair services found ready customers in the Californios. The company also had a robust lumber industry, shipping boards, beams, and planks to customers in California and the Hawaiian Islands. They could even ship entire houses, which they would build and then ship disassembled. By 1817, the sea otters had been eliminated due in part to Russian hunting, but Russians also did good in California, like bringing the first vaccine to Monterey in 1821. Many European inventions also came from the Russians, like glass windows, stoves, and all-wood housing. From 1824 to 1836, Mexico and the Russians at Fort Ross were involved in a complex and sometimes confrontational relationship. In 1834, Mexican Governor Jose Figueroa granted Rancho Petaluma to Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, and in 1835 made him the highest military commander in Northern California. He encouraged Vallejo to build the Presidio of Sonoma next to Mission San Francisco Solano in 1836 to discourage the Russians from settling any further south. In 1839, John Sutter was given land in the Central Valley from Mexican Governor Juan Bautista Alvarado for the sake of curtailing American, Indian, Russian, and British encroachment in Alta California. By then, Fort Ross's agricultural importance had decreased, and fur-bearing marine mammals had been overhunted. The property was acquired by the state of California in 1906. Today, most buildings are reconstructions. The only original structure left is the Rotchev House, the Commandant's house. Fort Ross is a fascinating stop within the history of the missions and the state of California. Mission San Rafael Archangel is named after the angel of bodily healing. This is entirely fitting because it was established as an asistencia, or helper, to Mission Dolores and the ill Northern California natives devastated by the inclement weather of San Francisco. It was founded on December 4, 1817, by Father Jose Vicente de Sarria. Within a year, there were 300 sick natives here, and in October of 1822, it was decided it could become a mission in its own right. Mission San Rafael was the first mission to be secularized by the Mexican government, and by 1844 it had been abandoned. It was sold in 1846 for $8,000. The mission was used by John Fremont as his headquarters during the Bear Flag Revolt, and by 1861 the buildings were in disrepair. In 1870, all the mission's buildings were razed. Only a pear tree from the original mission's orchard remained. In 1909, the Native Sons of the Golden West began the replacement of the mission when they erected a bell and a sign on the original site. In 1940, a Hearst Foundation grant allowed for a replica of the original 1818 structure to be built. It is one of the smallest missions and is overshadowed by the tower of the adjacent Church of St. Rafael. Mission San Rafael Archangel may have a window like Mission Carmel, but where Mission Carmel is one of the most impressive of the missions in the chain, Mission San Rafael is known as the most obliterated of California's missions. Mission San Francisco Solano in Sonoma, California, is the 21st of the California missions. It is the end of the Mission Trail and the 300-year history of Spanish and Mexican settlement in California.
This is Sonoma Mission. Mission San Francisco de Solano.
Before the mission, this land was home to the Coast Miwok, Southern Pomo, Wapo, Suisunis, and Patwin peoples. They were known for their skilled basket weaving and reliance on the natural resources in the area, including fishing and hunting. The mission was founded July 4, 1823, and is named for St. Francis Solanus, a missionary to Peru in the 1500s. This last mission is unique because it is the only mission founded after Mexico's independence from Spain and without prior approval of the Church. The driving force behind the Church's founding is Father Jose Altamira. He had been working at Mission San Francisco de Asís, but didn't care for it, and he decided to found his own mission. He received permission from Governor Don Luis Arguello due to the governor's own agenda. Arguello wanted to block the Russians at Bodega Bay and Fort Ross from moving any further inland. He and Father Altamira worked together to propose moving both San Francisco de Asís and the San Rafael Asistencia into the new mission in Sonoma. Work on the new mission was halted on order from Father Presidente de Sarria because the diocese felt the era of the missions was coming to a close. Work was allowed to resume when it was agreed that Mission San Francisco de Asís and Mission San Rafael would not be closed, and instead, Mission San Francisco Solano would become the 21st California mission. The domestic chores done at all the missions also took place at Mission San Francisco Solano, even on windy days.
Today at the mission, it's about 100 degrees out here. I can only imagine making bread in a fire like this, oven like that. Make it a little warm. Here are the barracks in Sonoma.
The mission is located across the street from the Sonoma Military Barracks, built in 1836 by General Vallejo for Mexican troops. It is here where the first bear flag was raised over California on July 14, 1846, proclaiming California a republic and independent from Mexico. In 1833, in a move to remove all Spanish influence from Alta California, Mexico secularized Mission San Francisco Solano and all the other missions. In 1834, the mission was closed, and Mariano Vallejo, commandant of the Presidio of San Francisco, was named administrator. The mission fell into disrepair. Sonoma was growing, and people stole building materials from the mission's ruins, which led to further degradation of the building. In 1841, a small adobe chapel was built to replace the original that had collapsed. That building was destroyed by the 1906 earthquake, but this building was restored in the 1940s. The interior of the chapel is now patterned after the interiors of mission churches, which were decorated by the neophytes. Some of the wall paintings depict the architectural features found in the great Baroque cathedrals of Mexico and Spain, as seen next to these sacred statues. Other decorations are stylized representations of nature, such as hills, flowers, and running streams. The eye above the altar is referred to as the eye of heaven, which the Father said allowed God to keep a watchful eye on the church. The 14 Stations of the Cross and other framed paintings are authentic mission period relics. In 1863, President Lincoln transferred ownership of Mission San Francisco Solano back to the Roman Catholic Church. In 1881, the property was sold to a businessman and a new parish church was built across town. In 1903, remaining buildings were bought by the California Historic Landmarks League and by 1913 had been restored. Today, Mission San Francisco Solano has the authentic contours devoted to the mission's rich history and to the history of all the missions in the state of California.